Beer of the week, beer of the week, yeah.
And that is going to be BJCP category 9A, which I believe is dark German lager or malty German lager.
It's strong German lager.
Strong German lager, and that
Strong
is
European
a
lager.
Doppelbock.
Yeah.
The Doppelbock.
So Doppelbock, as most of you guys know, is it's like you take a bock but you doppel it. So it's a bigger bock. It's a nice sweet beer with a wide color range like the last few beers that we've done. But most often you'll see it in that medium amber to slightly brown color. And it's always going to have kind of a rich malty hue to it in the middle. So it's never going to be, just this blackish brown or
I call it garnety.
Yeah, very garnety. And that comes from a lot of caramelization that happens actually in the cooking process for doing a Doppelbock properly.
Bottom line is that these guys are rich and delicious and heavy Maillard.
And a perfect thing to both drink right now and to brew right now. Overall impressions are it's a malty sweet German lager, so it should come off as clean. It should have subtle fruity notes without being excessively fruity. And those fruity notes should really serve to amplify a heavy Maillard character that comes from the malts and the process used. They can go from 7 to 10% alcohol. Yeah. Original gravity anywhere from 1072 to 1.112. That's because these beers can also finish very, very sweet. Their final gravity can be all the way up to 1.024, which is about the same finishing gravity as you expect the high end of a Baltic Porter to be. It's going to be viscous. The driest it can be is 1016. So these are thicker beers. And overall, the hops on this should be very, very subdued or very, very minimal. If any, they're going to be a subtle German character, that classic grassy and lemony note that you get off of a lot of German hops. Yeah. But overall, they play a background character to the beautiful orchestra of malt and subtle yeast fruitiness that you can get.
So speaking of malt, let's go right into our malt of the week. Typically, Doppelbocks are going to have a base malt of a pretty high percentage of Munich, if not
Munich or Vienna. It can be up to 100%.
Yeah, exactly. So a heavy Munich or Vienna base malt, but also they can benefit from a small amount of adjunct malts. And for our case today, we chose Best Malls Biscuit Malt.
Biscuit malt's nice because it has that toasty Maillard character without being as pungent as something like a Melanoid malt, and also with a little bit of diastatic power, so it can play a background role while amplifying the maltiness of your beer if you don't want to do, let's say, a decoction mash or an excessively long boil.
And just like the description actually says on Best Malls, it's hilarious. It actually says to give the beer a little extra.
A little extra.
And that's what it does, yeah. So it's building off of, like Peter said, those Maillard type characters. You're just getting a little extra of that breadiness, a little bit of that slight toasted profile to the beer. As for specs on it, fairly light in color. Gonna give your beer a slight sort of brownish hue, but otherwise not gonna have any diastatic power. I would generally recommend using this as about 5-ish% of your total grain bill. And with that said, that might actually be a pretty substantial amount, just because for a beer like this, for a 5-gallon batch, you are looking at about a 15 up to even a 20-pound grain bill.
It's one of those beer styles that technique actually does play a pretty big role. That said, you don't have to decoct. We all know decocting sucks.
Yeah. I do think a step mash would actually be beneficial, though.
For sure.
Doing a protein rest on a beer like this, so doing that, low temp, what is it, mid to low teens in Fahrenheit, so like 113 I think is the number comes to my mind, for a protein rest for about 20 minutes before you raise it up to a saccharification rest, is actually going to help that beer from getting a little bit too chewy, sort of keep that dry body despite having the high final gravity on there. So
Fun facts with Timothy.
Did you know that a cluster of bananas is called a hand and a single banana is called a finger? Yeah. Now you do.
Fun facts with Timothy.
Let's go into our hop of the week. Our hop of the week is going to be
Monroe, it looks like.
Monroe is a classic German style hop. Well, it's bred off of a classic German hop, but it has adapted to have a subtle berry note to it.
So my experience with brewing it is that it's a subtle hop. So I can see it working really well in something like a Doppelbock that you're trying to keep your bitterness levels to a minimum. That the hops aren't really there to do anything besides just balance out that sweetness a little bit.
Yeah, and it's one of the hops that I kind of categorize as being in the same range that has a little bit of like a white wine kind of character, just because they are background hops. They're not going to be particularly pungent because of low total oils. And so having a subtle berry and white wine note, if the hop does show through, is going to just add a little bit of complexity that should help develop the yeast profile. And again, it's going to be a boozy beer, so having something in the flavor profile that might lean into that, if it shows up at all, will help. That said, you can use literally any hop. This is not a hop forward beer.
So that is Monroe for you. Yeah, so what are we talking like? These beers are like 20-ish IBU, I want to say. Pull those stats up, Pedro. And yeah, I would do, typically you'll see a bittering edition.
16 to 26.
And then usually about half of even what your bittering edition is as some kind of late edition. I feel like you can make these beers without having any late edition, and they'll be just as tasty, to be honest. So
yeah, but if you do something like a small amount at 15 minutes and a small amount at 60 would be totally fine. You just definitely don't want to be loading up that back end. And with something like Monroe, more than 2 ounces of this hop would be inappropriate for the style.
So as for our yeast of the week, back to our Doppelbock, we got 2308 from Y Yeast. That's going to be their Munich Lager strain, and this is just the classic strain. You're going to use this for Doppelbocks, for actually for Vienna lagers also it can work. For Schwarzbier it works fantastic. And this is just going to push through that maltiness even more. It's going to be slightly less sharp compared to like our
American lager, or Czech
American
lager,
or even the 3470.
Yeah.
I would say it's not going to push through that minerality quite as much. And it can actually get fruity if you ferment it on the high side. So I do recommend a traditional cold fermentation, usually right around 50 degrees Fahrenheit for this strain.
Not that a little bit of fruitiness would be necessarily terrible, but if that gets too excessive, what it can do is start weighing down the palate because you've got a ton of sweetness already.
Yeah.
So extra yeast fruitiness, above a certain level can definitely start to weigh down that palate and make it, from something that should be fairly drinkable, fairly sessionable for such a high ABV beer to something that really just sits on your tongue and makes you not want to drink more.
Exactly, and most people don't realize you're actually going to get a small degree of like I call it that real nice like cherry delicate stone fruit character just from having a higher alcohol fermentation in the get-go. So
alcohol is sweet, by the way. A lot of people think of alcohol like Monarch vodka, where it's going to be all like fusely and gross. Alcohol, if done correctly in a proper beautiful fermentation, is mildly sweet.
On that note too, I would definitely recommend building up either a very large starter or consider double or triple pitching for this style, just so that you're not stressing out that yeast. Because if you are, you got to realize you are going to be pushing that 8%, maybe 9% mark. So with that combined with
a cold fermentation,
a cold fermentation, you got to make sure that you have a really, really healthy pitch going into that beer.
Oxygenation is going to be super important. Some sort of aeration if you can do it. Obviously, nutrients, energizer. Just throw the works at this and make sure that your yeast get the job done.
I would shoot for if you're doing a 5-gallon batch, shoot for about 300 to 400 billion cells, which is if we're talking about the YE Smack Packs, that's 4 of those. As for the water profile, it kind of sits right in the middle of, I think, the sort of German beer profiles, ranging from very soft to moderately hard, and this one kind of sits in the middle of that. Generally speaking, you're going to have a moderate amount of bicarbonates, with a little bit higher sodium chloride in there. So your chlorides might be 15, 20 ppm, but really not much else going on. So keep it pretty simple.
Keep everything under 60 ppm. If your chlorides go a little bit on the high side in that mid-range to like 30, 35, it's not going to be the end of the world.
Yeah.
I would say most German water profiles actually have more sodium in them than a standard profile. So like in America, we'll see sodium below 10 ppm a lot, at least where we live. In Germany, it's pretty common to have those up to 60 even, but I wouldn't keep it that high. I would keep it in that 35 range.
Keep the total sulfates down. So you definitely don't want to have that ratio any higher than a 1-to-1 for your chloride to sulfate. So
Yeah.
if anything, have a higher chloride ratio. Fairly neutral water profile. I guess that's what I should have said right at the get-go.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it for Doppelbock. Send us a picture of your favorite Doppelbock. Tag us on Instagram of you drinking a Doppelbock, and then we'll share it to our page.